So now we're going to talk about something I'm sure you're all very interested in. The money, the numbers. How do these numbers work? Who makes money here? So here's a little example of 3 parties to a deal. You have, in one case, you have, let's start with Target stores. You'll see a t-shirt, in this case a Star Trek t-shirt, that's being sold at Target. It's being sold for $10. That's the retail price to the customer. It's made by a company called XYZ T-Shirt Company. And for them, it cost them $3 to make that shirt, and they sell it at a wholesale price of $5. They sell it to Target for $5. And then you have Star Trek. And of course, all these numbers are fictitious. We can ask the Star Trek and the T-shirt expert how close this is to reality later. But we have Star Trek, and for this example, we're using 10% royalty. So Star Trek, they make money too. They get their royalty, and the royalty is based on wholesale sales. So here's a quick question. Looking at this chart, the finance people, who makes more money here? The retailer, manufacturer, or Star Trek? Star Trek. You think Star Trek makes more money, okay? Any other guesses? Target. Target and the retailer, okay. So the answer is, and we'll break it down, is that if you were to just look, it is Target stores. The retailer are making most of the money on this transaction. They make a healthy margin of $5 or 50% markup. The manufacturer is making a decent margin, just an example. And Star Trek, they don't make the most money, but they're making 50 cents on this transaction, 10% of the $5. But what's interesting is that they probably have very little overhead for that transaction. So that's a nice margin that they enjoy, probably the highest margin. When I worked at Warner Brothers, and as I mentioned before, we had 450 different licensing partners. When we were working on doing deals, it was really focused on 2 numbers. Of course, there's a lot of terms that we'll get into at the end of this presentation, but there's 2 key numbers that you negotiate. The first is royalty rate. And the royalty rate ranges, and we can have a discussion about the royalty rate later, but 10% is on average a good rate for an apparel product. We've seen rates in the ranges for a t-shirt of 8%, upwards of 15%. We've seen rates of food products from 3% to 5%. We've seen rates, and they change based on 2 things. They change based on one thing. What is that? Demand, supply and demand. How many other people want it? How popular it is. And if it's very popular, you'll have a lot of competition that might bid up that royalty rate. So number 1 number that we would work on and negotiate was the royalty rate. Second number is what we call the minimum royalty payment guarantee. So stay with me for a minute. This is also called the minimum guarantee, sometimes just called the guarantee. And let me tell you how we typically get there. Because if at the end of this, and you're going to have time at the end to go and start pitching deals to each other, is if I was doing a deal with you and I say, all right, you're a t-shirt company and I'm Star Trek, I would go to you and say, how many t-shirts do you think you could sell in a year? And you might say, oh, Star Trek, I could sell 200,000 t-shirts. Well, 200,000 t-shirts in 1 year at $5 wholesale cost, that means you're going to make $1 million of sales. And then we said that the royalty rate is 10%. So then we figure out that the projected royalty payment is $100,000, 10% times $1 million. So you're projecting, I didn't tell you that number, you're telling me that you think you could sell $1 million and that you're going to pay me 100 grand in 1 year. So I would then turn around to you and say, okay, I want the minimum royalty payment guarantee to be half, to be $50,000. I want you, it's your own projection, to guarantee me half of that, which means that if you make your 200,000 t-shirts, this number doesn't even come into play. It's, nobody will ever talk about that if you hit your number. But if for some reason you only sold 1 t-shirt or you hit some hitch, nobody wanted to buy it, then all of a sudden you're on the hook for $50,000. So that's the minimum royalty payment guarantee.